Chivalry. The term as it's used today is generally used in reference to the appropriate behavior of a gentleman, especially in reference to how they're supposed to treat a lady. But in the Middle Ages, the term meant something more. Something more. It was an informal code that represented the best attributes of knightly conduct and virtue. It wasn't always formally compiled, it certainly wasn't strictly adhered to, but people of the era recognized chivalry when they saw it. In 1341, John III, the Duke of the sovereign Duchy of Brittany, died and left behind somewhat contradictory instructions as to who was supposed to take his place. The little-remembered war that followed mirrored some of the early stages of the 100 Years' War, but it led to one of the Middle Ages' best displays of chivalry, the combat of the 30, which still today impacts our romantic vision of the knight in shining armor. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Chivalry has a long and complex history as part of a European conception of the Christian warrior. Uncodified, the tradition of a social code that belongs to knights and warriors reaches far back into history. In Rome, there was the equites class, originally wealthy patrician soldiers, and similar codes existed as tradition from the Islamic Moors. The term itself comes from Old French word for horsemanship, reflecting the medieval European and Carolinian idea that knights were wealthy men who could afford armor and a horse. The term came to exemplify a broader ideal of Christian piety, noble warriorship, and courtly love like that exemplified in European romantic literature, especially in the Matters of France, legendary stories of Charlemagne and his knights, and the Matters of Britain, which told supposedly historic tales of England and Brittany, like the story of King Arthur. The chivalric code had multiple and sometimes contradictory meanings and definitions, but focused on a handful of chivalric virtues such as loyalty, gratitude, self-control, martial ability, and honor. Knights had a duty to their countrymen and fellow Christians, a duty to God and knightly piety, and a duty to service and gentleness to women. The code formed in the period between 1170 and 1220, becoming the ideal ethos of the European knight. Those living in the Middle Ages very much believed that the stories of Arthur and Charlemagne were both historically accurate and represented a former age of illustrious, well-behaved knights. This was juxtaposed with the reality of Middle Age Europe, replete with frequent warfare, poor nutrition and hygiene, and the squalid struggles of day-to-day life. Historical study has shown that the idea was a myth. 19th century historian Jean-Charles Simon said, "Chivalry is the ideal world, such as it existed in the imaginations of the Romance writers. The chivalrous age is always represented as distant from us, both in time and space, but when examined, the periods it's specifically attributed to fail to live up to the chivalric ideals." The myth of an age of chivalry doesn't mean that the code itself was fake, however. The concept of a noble code of conduct far predates the Middle Ages and developed especially in the court and army of Charlemagne, as changing concepts of warfare and the feudal system came into place. Implicit in the code was loyalty to one's feudal lord, as well as observance of the rules of warfare. To some extent, it was reflective of the church, trying to control endemic violence related to the common castes of medieval society, those who pray, those who work, and those who fight. But chivalry was never a strict code that could not be broken. In fact, the intrinsic conflict between the morals of Christianity and the violent pragmatism of actual warfare were often studiously ignored in the face of political realities, like the War of Breton Succession. The Dukes of Brittany held the duchy as a fief for the King of France, but were also earls in England. The Duke Arthur II was the grandson of Henry III of England and Duke of Brittany from 1305. He married twice, first to Marie, Viscountess of Limoges, with whom he had 3 sons, including his heir, John III, and later to Yolande, Countess of Montfort. With Yolande he had one more son, called John of Montfort. John III became Duke on the death of his father in 1312, and spent a lot of time trying to annul his father's second marriage, to disinherit his half-siblings, specifically John of Montfort, but apparently because he disliked his stepmother. John III married 3 times, but failed to produce an heir, and chose his niece Joan as heiress, and she married Charles, Count of Blois, a nephew of the French king. Later in his reign, however, John III reconciled with Montfort and left a will that named him heir. The Duke died in 1341, and his last words on who should follow him were uttered on his deathbed. "For God's sake, leave me alone and do not trouble my spirit with such things." Fighting broke out immediately as Montfort moved to secure important cities, including the ducal seat and treasury. Charles also claimed the duchy with the support of much of the Breton nobility. What could have remained a local affair was complicated by war between France and England when in 1337 the first fighting of the 100 Years' War broke out. The truce that had held in 1341 seemed tenuous at best. Philip VI supported his nephew, leaving Montfort to seek aid from the English king, Edward III. The truce prevented Edward from sending troops to France, but unfortunately it didn't stop France from dealing with internal affairs. Montfort was forced to surrender by the citizens of Nantes, and his wife, Joan of Flanders, was left to lead in the name of their 3-year-old son. Montfort was released 2 years later, but the Montfortist cause struggled in Brittany against Blois and the French crown. Montfort fought again in Brittany with English support, but died suddenly in 1345. Joanna again led for her 5-year-old son, also John, as the leader of the Montforts. Blois was captured by the Montfortists in 1347, leaving his own wife, Joan, as the nominal leader of the Blois faction. An uneasy truce was forced upon all of them by the pressure of the Pope, as the male claimants were indisposed. But the truce offered a unique opportunity for a display of chivalry, because ostensibly knights on both sides were serving ladies, as the male leaders were gone. And that was an opportune time to defend their cause's honor. According to the chronicler Jean de Froissart, in 1351, Jean de Beaumanoir, who commanded the pro-Blois garrison at Josselin, issued a challenge to Robert Bemborough, the English commander at the nearby garrison at Plomerel. The challenge was for the two men to battle it out in a duel, but Bemborough suggested that it would be better if they did a full tournament, saying, "We will choose 20 or 30 of our companions in the garrison, and we'll go to an open field, and there will be a fight, as long as we can endure it, and let God give the victory to the better of us." Beaumanoir enthusiastically agreed. Jean de Froissart and another contemporary chronicle suggest that the motivation for the combat was a purely chivalric exercise. It wasn't uncommon. While the reality of war was often brutal, tournaments were an excellent opportunity to earn renown, and sometimes knights fighting on rival sides would compete in tourneys against each other in the middle of other conflicts. Knights could also earn renown in duels, both for their military prowess and their generosity in either victory or defeat. Later French chronicles and ballads say it wasn't chivalry at stake, instead painting Bemborough and the English as villains, bad Christians who were oppressing the peasants. And of course the English likely were supplying their stores on the backs of those who work. The battle was to take place midway between the two castles on the halfway oak, and would, like any good tournament, be watched by a good-sized crowd. The identities of the 60 fighters are recorded. On the French side were 9 nobles and 21 squires, all Bretons. The English soldiers are more difficult to trace. Froissart calls Bemborough, also recorded as Brambro or Brandeborsch, a German, while other sources and research claim he was English. 6 of the soldiers definitely were German mercenaries, and several of the English were mercenaries too. 2 would later become somewhat famous, including Hugh Cavely, a lower-class soldier who would eventually marry an Aragonese princess. The two parties gathered at the halfway oak on the 26th of March, 1351, with retinues, ladies, priests, and even refreshments. The parties had agreed to a number of rules and agreed to fight without reinforcement at an out-trance, that is, until one side's warriors were all either dead, disabled, or captured. Most importantly, they all agreed not to run away. After hearing Mass, confessing, and receiving absolution, the 60 men lined up 30 apiece across from each other and charged. The first clash of arms was loud and violent, and after the initial meeting, the fighting broke up man to man. The knights chose all their own weapons. One carried a 25-pound hammer, while others carried swords, daggers, spears, and axes. Froissart's chronicle says they fought fiercely, all in a pile, rescuing one another handsomely when they saw their companions in trouble. Sources disagree somewhat, but in the first melee, the English came out on top, losing 2 to the French's 4 or 5 dead and wounded. They fought to exhaustion, and then they agreed to a brief truce. The truce was a chance to rest, take refreshment, bind wounds, and repair damaged armor and weapons. The rest was short, and soon they joined the battle again, which went on as fiercely as before. During the second combat, Bemborough was struck by one of the French squires and wounded, perhaps by a lance strike to the face. As he attempted to regain his feet, another Frenchman, allegedly the knight Sieur de Bois, charged and killed him with a battle-axe. Shocked, a Dutch mercenary called Crocard took charge of the English and decided upon a new strategy. The English gathered together tightly to fight the Franco-Britons and again gave them a beating, wounding and killing several. Beaumanoir himself was injured and called for water. De Bois is said to have shouted, "Drink thy blood, Beaumanoir, your thirst will pass soon." The battle seemed sure to go to the English until one of the French soldiers mounted a horse and charged the tight-knit English. Exhausted, they could not stand, and the formation collapsed. The French attacked with newfound ferocity, and the English were forced to surrender. There are significant disagreements on the number killed and injured, but the English were certainly worse off, with 9 or 10 killed, while the French suffered maybe half as many killed, while nearly everyone suffered wounds. The remaining English warriors were imprisoned at Josselin, although they were all released shortly after with the payment of a ransom. Ultimately, the display had no impact on the war. Fighting would continue for another 14 years, but finally Charles of Blois was killed in combat at the Battle of Auray. John of Montfort became John IV, Duke of Brittany, and gave his feudal oath to the King of France, along with a few other concessions. A few who heard of the combat thought of it as foolish. Froissart recorded that they felt it was the product of presumption and rashness, but most contemporary observers celebrated the combat as an incredible display of chivalry. All involved had followed a set of rules, had fought with bravery and to exhaustion, and had comported themselves with the general traits of decent knights. The earliest chronicle of the events was by the French historian Jean de Lebel. Froissart's later chronicles seem to borrow liberally from this account. Lebel, who was relatively unique for the period in that he sought to narrate battles only if he witnessed the event or interviewed someone who did, said that the battle was a most marvelous deed of arms that should never be forgotten. Froissart was happy to add that all the warriors fought as valiantly on both sides as if they'd been Rolands or Olivers, referring to the lead characters of the French epic poem The Song of Roland. Froissart said he personally met a scarred survivor, Yves Charel, honored years later at the French court, purely because of his reputation as one of the 30. The event was continually referenced as an example of chivalry as well, though in the reality of history its reputation may be owed to how grubby and vicious much of the rest of the fighting was. Many of the participants were at best on the edges of respectability, easily labeled mercenaries and opportunists, but the chronicles focused on how the deed was done and not who won, and it overshadowed any individual reputation. Of course, as with many things, interpretation of the event was not static. Roughly contemporaneous was a widely published poem written by an unnamed Briton who portrayed the English as villains, intent on avenging the death of the English general Sir Dagworth. The poet also portrays Bamborough as a poor Christian who put his faith in the prophecies of Merlin. It was this version that became ascendant in later France as histories of the war became more nationalistic. Napoleon sought to erect a monument to the fallen Britons, though it wasn't actually erected until 1819 under Louis XVIII, with the inscription that 30 Britons, whose names are given as follows, fought to defend the poor, laborers, and craftsmen, and they vanquished foreigners attracted on the soil of the country by fateful descents. The English took a somewhat different stand. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a fictional version of the battle in his novel Sir Nigel, which contends that the charge on horseback was cheating on the part of the French. The combat of the 30 was a minor battle in a relatively minor theater of the 100 Years' War, but it took on an outsized importance in the minds of medieval chroniclers who saw any example of chivalry as a shining ideal that should be imitated, a bright spot in otherwise dark times. The combat was more important for what it represented than anything accomplished. It was never intended to decide the outcome of a war. For its participants, it allowed them the opportunity to show chivalry and honor that was at odds with the reality of the times and the war and their role in it, which largely consisted of robbing peasants for their daily bread. But the combat inspired people both at the time and for generations to come, and it still impacts our vision of knights and chivalry today. And that's perhaps because then, as now, people have a desire to see the world not through the grim reality of what is, but through the shining example of what can be. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.